Greetings in the Lord. My name is Father Tom Legere, and welcome to Real. Welcome also back to our continuing series on the spiritual journey. We are coming to you tonight from Vasey Theater at Villanova University. What would you say if I told you that I could give you 12 steps that would help you in your spiritual growth? Well, that's what we're going to do tonight. So it should be interesting. Later on, everybody in the audience will have the opportunity to ask plenty of questions. But right now, let's take a break, and we'll see you shortly.
From the Vatican to St. Hubert's, from Saudi Arabia to Mayfair, the Catholic Standard and Times, the official newspaper of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, brings the world into your home each week. The Standard provides a Catholic overview of events around the globe and in your neighborhood. For just 36 cents an issue, you can keep your family informed from a Catholic perspective, formed in its faith and inspired by the lives of others. The Catholic Standard and Times, serving more than 1 million Catholics in the Delaware Valley, make it your favorite newspaper.
Tonight, then, we are going to take a look at 12 steps that will be helpful to all of us on our spiritual journeys. The first step is act as though you believe in the spiritual realm. Now, that may seem to be a small thing, but it isn't. I think it is more difficult today to be a believer than it ever was, even in the time of Christ. Because when he was around, his task, his challenge, was to convince people that his version of spiritual reality made more sense than other people's versions of spiritual reality. However, today, we have to convince people, and sometimes even convince ourselves, that there is such a thing as spiritual reality. When you tell people that you believe in eternal life, when you tell people that you believe that love is the most important thing in the world, they often look at you like a side dish they didn't order. Kind of like, you mean you still believe in that kind of stuff? So there are tremendous forces working against all of us trying to take our spiritual growth seriously. So what we need to do is overcome the bias of the world and overcome our own particular biases and really believe that there is such a thing, throw ourselves into it. Now, this is not a blind belief. It's not like, well, you just believe and that's it, you don't question. No, later on you get a chance to experience the reality of the spiritual. But the thing is, you'll never have that experience until, first of all, you give it a shot. So you have to act as though it's true, even if you don't feel that it is at the time. Even if there's a little voice inside of you saying, this is crazy. Believe anyhow, and your belief will eventually bear fruit. Secondly, and similar to that, is undertake the quest with serious purpose. The spiritual journey is not for dabblers. You don't just get into spiritual growth for the weekend or your latest project for the month. It's a commitment. When you begin to start really meditating and open up your mind and working with your dreams and doing all the other things associated with the spiritual journey, know that it is a commitment. It's like opening up Pandora's box. You don't just open it up and then feel, well, I can close it anytime I want. The only way out is through. Once you begin the path, know that it's serious business. And it is for people who aren't playing games, but are really ready to commit themselves to the path. Thirdly, seek some companionship and spiritual direction for the inner journey. Now, for the Christian, clearly, we already have a spiritual director. Who's that? That's Jesus. He's our spiritual director. So if anybody asks you, do you have a spiritual director? You say, yes, it's Jesus, it's the Lord. However, we also need some human companionship to help us bounce our ideas off of. and to help us not kid ourselves. So it's really important to have some kind of community. Some people think that they can take the spiritual journey all by themselves. The spiritual traditions all indicate that that's dangerous and probably impossible. If you're serious about the spiritual quest, you need some kind of fellowship, some kind of community. Fourthly, we need to learn the value of silence on our spiritual quest. We live in a society today that doesn't know the meaning of silence and introversion. We are extroverted to a fault. Don't worry that, well, if I start thinking this way, then maybe I'm going to get too introverted. That's probably no danger at all for most Americans. Most of us don't have that problem. We have the other problem. Namely, we're so out there, we're so involved, we're so constantly bombarded with noise and with activity that we never take any time for silence and looking within. And the fact of the matter is, you never really can take that spiritual journey until you begin to pull yourself away a little bit and to start looking deep inside. It's also important for us to learn the value of genuine fasting. A lot of times when people hear that, they tend to think that fasting is a form of self-punishment. You fast as a form of penance. Actually, fasting is one of the most important things you can do for your spiritual growth. You fast, in a sense, now get this, for a pleasurable purpose. Namely, when you are fasting, you experience life with greater intensity. You experience the presence of God with greater clarity. Fasting is present in all the great religions of the world. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad went so far as to say that fasting is the cornerstone of all religions. We know that Jesus himself fasted 40 days in the desert, and he fasted often. And he told us, not if you fast, but he said, when you fast. So as far as Jesus is concerned, it's not even an option for the Christian. It is a necessity and part of the journey. Now, I'm sure a lot of people have never really tried that and have a tendency to write it off as something that just wouldn't work for them. And the only thing I can say there is give it a try. Don't knock it until you've tried it. Sometimes when I fast, it is then that I'm able to think the clearest and I feel most in tune with God. You've probably had some experience of that, like if you're going to take a big test. The last thing you want to do is take the big test on a full stomach, right? Here you have a big final exam coming up and you stuff yourself for lunch and you go in there and you just don't feel right. But yet when you're lean and mean, when you're really feeling hungry, then you're more open to reality and your mind works sharper and you're more able to tune in to the spirit that is found within. And then finally, learn to use the forgotten faculty of the imagination. The images that are powerful that we experience in our dreams can also be experienced to some extent when we are awake. Artists have an experience of this. Really good artists. They don't decide what they're going to paint. A really good artist waits and waits for the images to come up. So we can get in touch with those images that are inside ourselves and also learn to use the powerful images and symbols in our Catholic tradition in particular that really are extremely moving to all of us. Well, there's a lot more that we can say about additional steps for spiritual growth, and we'll be getting to them shortly. But right now, let's take a break.
Is everyone about ready? We're going to be late for church.
John, I hope you're putting on your good shoes.
Everyone looks so nice.
We seldom realize what we have until it's gone. Religious freedom, A message from your Catholic neighbors.
"20 years ago, leukemia and related diseases took the lives of enough people to fill a ballpark. But today, more people are surviving, thanks to research by the Leukemia Society of America."
Hi, I'm Gary Carter. Join the team that's striking out leukemia. The Leukemia Society of America. We're closing in on a killer.
Okay, we move on, taking a look at further steps of our spiritual growth. And one thing I want to say right at the beginning is that one thing that transcends all of these steps is the need to be in prayer. The Christian always has to be tuned in to that higher power, not just once, but on a daily basis. This is our lifeline. But here we're taking a look at some of the other practical steps that can be taken for our own spiritual growth. The seventh one is keep a journal. A journal is kind of like a spiritual diary. We can either write it as if we're recording things that happen to us in sort of an objective way. This happened today and this happened today. Not external things, because they're not really the issue here. What we're talking about is the movement of the Spirit within. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to talk about, how God is operating in our lives. So we can write it down in an objective way, or we can write it down in a dialogical fashion. For example, the way I keep a journal is every day I try to write a letter to the Lord. And I start it off with, "Dear Father," or "Dear Jesus." And I try to act as if I'm talking to the Lord. I find that is more beneficial. Rather than making it a head trip and just looking at things objectively, I feel like I'm more emotionally involved and more holistically involved when I can actually be facing God in an ongoing kind of a dialogue. So you can write down the things that are happening in your life. You can write down your dreams in your journal. You can write down the books that you are reading that are helpful to you. This is good. It helps give us some perspective in our lives. You know, sometimes we're really having a bad time of it and we're about ready to go take the gas pipe. And then we can flip open our journal and say, "Hey, a week ago wasn't that bad." And you get some kind of perspective as you see the ups and the downs and the movements of the Spirit in our lives. So think of keeping a spiritual journal. It could be very helpful. Secondly, record our dreams. This is so important that we actually made a whole show on Reel to Reel on how to interpret dreams. So if you haven't caught that show, perhaps you can catch it when we have a rerun, because that is so important that it just can't be underestimated. Let me just simply say this. Of all the different things that I've done on the spiritual path over the last 10 years in particular, probably recording my dreams has been the most beneficial. And I'll tell you why. Because I get this clear signal that God is operating in my life. I see things happening in my dreams. I get messages. I'm clear about the fact that God is not a distant reality, but God is an imminent reality inside myself that is speaking to me every day of my life. So really consider the possibility of taking dreams a lot more seriously in your life. Next, be as honest with yourself as you can and get someone to help you be honest. Try not to delude yourself, and try to get a person who is going to call you to accountability. You know how we can all con ourselves. We can talk ourselves into anything. But if you have a good friend who says, "Hey, well, that's a lot of baloney," and we go, "Hey, what do you mean?" And you listen to them because you respect them. So share with a friend. It doesn't have to be some formal spiritual director or anything. Just share with somebody who is a soulmate, a real brother or sister in the Lord. And that person will help you to be honest with yourself and really face yourself as you are. The next thing is, let your life manifest real love. There are probably 50 different spiritual values that we can focus on, but love is what it's really all about. Jesus, in fact, was a love mystic. That was the most important reality for him. We even have the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, focusing on the heart center. That's always been a big thing in Christianity. Our belief that all the spiritual insight in the world, all the heightened consciousness in the world doesn't amount to a hill of beans unless you can translate that into washing the feet of your brothers and sisters. That's really what the whole thing boils down to. So don't be afraid to say yes to love, because as St. John tells us, God is love. And when we are closest to the mystery of love, it is then that we are closest to the mystery of God. So allow love to really invade and take over your very being. Another thing that's important is persistence and courage. There will be times when you're really discouraged on the spiritual path. One reason is that you don't get much support from the people around you. Let's face it, the people around you, for the most part, think that you're Don Quixote off trying to joust with windmills. And they're going to laugh at you and tear you down in 50 different ways. So you have to hang in there. That's where the courage comes in. And you also need courage when you look at yourself and when you realize all the work that needs to be done. Sometimes when you look at yourself, you feel like just throwing your hands up in the air and saying, this is crazy. You know, who needs all this? I don't feel like I've made any progress spiritually. I'm about the same place I was 20 years ago. There are all these little temptations that enter into our lives as temptations really for us to just give up. So that's when we have to gird ourselves with persistence and courage and believe that we're in this thing for the long haul. We're long-distance runners. It's easy to be a sprinter. You just give it a shot for 100 yards and that's the end of it. But try running a mile or 2 miles, or try running a long-distance race of a whole lifetime. That, I think, is what the Christian is called to. So it's not for dabblers, it's not for people who just think that they're going to give it a shot for a short period of time. Hang in there, and especially when it's the darkest in your life, chances are God is actually the closest then. So don't give up, be persistent, and be courageous. And finally, it's also important for us to give generously of our material goods. You know, sometime you may have heard in the past people say that it's impossible to give anything away. It's very true. If you give something out there, you're going to get it back again. You're going to get more than you gave away. It's a spiritual law. As the great philosopher Darrell Dawkins once said, whatever goes around comes around. And so give, and don't try to hold on to things. Be generous with the gifts that God has given you, and be generous with your material goods. Now, of course, you don't want to try to psych out the Lord and say, hey, this is a good way for me to get double. Say, I'll give things out. But when we are generous, then we get everything back. So at any one time, we can work on any one of these 12 steps, or perhaps we can work on all 12 at the same time. But whatever we do, let's realize that the Lord is calling each of us to walk the path, each in our own way. When we come back, we're going to have an opportunity for more questions and answers. See you soon. And now we have my favorite time of the show, the opportunity for questions and answers. Yes, ma'am.
Father, you talk about fasting as an aid to spiritual growth. Isn't there a real danger that fasting can produce chemical changes in the brain that might cause you to be confused, if not more than confused?
Well, if one is going to undertake a prolonged fast, one should only do so under a doctor's supervision. However, for most healthy, normal people, there won't be any significant changes in the chemical imbalance of the brain. In fact, there won't be any negatives that I can think of if a person undertakes, say, a 24-hour fast. We have this false belief that we have to constantly have food in our bodies. And the fact of the matter is, when you think of our ancestors in the cave, a day would go by sometime when food wasn't available, 2 days, 3 days. It wasn't that unusual. But we have this belief, unless we have 3 meals a day, we're going to die. And the fact is, we can very safely undergo fasting. Now, if we have some other problem like diabetes, or perhaps the person is pregnant, that is a mitigating circumstance. And if you're going to undertake a long fast, say 3 days or something like that, then you'd want to check it out with your doctor. But for people to go without food, normal, healthy people, for, say, a 24-hour fast is just good, sound, mental, and spiritual health, as far as I can see.
Well, Don, I happen to be a member of a prayer group, and it seems like whatever spiritual growth I've experienced has come when it seems like I wasn't even looking for it, by dealing with the problems and the that come up in the prayer group, and by trying to plan events, things like this. By the time when you get through that, you seem like you're a little bit further ahead than you were when you started. But you weren't even focusing on spiritual growth at all. Just more or less trying to help somebody else.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of this stuff that we talked about here can tend to be kind of esoteric and kind of indicative of somebody who is spending all sorts of formal time on spiritual growth. And I think the point that you make there is a good one. A lot of times we grow spiritually just through the circumstances of daily life, by changing our baby's diaper, and by helping out a friend who's in trouble, and cleaning up the church hall after a social. I mean, these things don't appear to be very spiritual, but oftentimes it's those kind of nitty-gritty things that really produce the most effective spiritual growth. I think that's what the Lord is getting at when he talks about the need to wash the feet of our brothers and sisters. And he says that's going to be the sign that you're growing in the Spirit, not that you have visions or that you record your dreams or do a lot of the other things I was talking about. But in the final analysis, it boils down to love, reaching out to the people in our lives in often undramatic, very concrete ways. Good point. Yes, sir.
Yes. Although the rewards of my spiritual growth, such as the increased capacity to love, the peace of mind, they are motivators for me to grow in the spirit life. But unfortunately, my primary motivator seems to be pain associated with self-will. Will there ever come a point where this will cease and the positive will be the primary motivator?
It's possible, but I think somewhat unlikely. St. Teresa of Avila said, and she's a pretty good authority, that there are very few people who do anything purely out of the love of God. That most of us do things, even grow spiritually, because we realize that in the final analysis, it's in our own best interest. And we do grow that way often because of pain. I've found in my own life, in the lives of other people, this is often one of the things that really gets us moving. Priest psychologist Morton Kelsey, in fact, says whenever you have a neurosis, he said, thank God for it, because that is probably an opportunity for the Lord to crack the husk of the ego that you have. So it begins with pain, but it always ends up with a blessing. And paradoxically enough, when you start looking at it in faith, you find out that even the pain really is a blessing in disguise. Mary?
Father, you mentioned that there are tremendous forces working against those who would take the spiritual journey seriously. But I think you mentioned mostly the personal, interpersonal struggles that we have in conflicts. But also in society today, there are many forces which could make someone feel overwhelmed, such as astrophysics and medical technology. How could we encourage and support, say, our youth and young people who grow up in this society with this insecurity that can come from that?
This is where community comes in. That's why it's so important for our young people to be nurtured in some kind of a semi-protective environment in which they are given the most important values in their lives. Because when they leave that community, they're going to get all the other stuff. They're going to get people who will tear down the things that are really important in their life, and often in a very glib, articulate fashion. And here we are trying to build people up and to tell them what really needs to be done. So I think you begin in small ways. You begin in families, you begin with little prayer groups, you begin in parishes, and you try to stick together. I think the idea of us going off to an island somewhere and starting over again just doesn't work. There aren't any more islands, I don't think, to be discovered. There's no more continents that we can go to. This is it. We have to live in a pluralistic society that often contradicts and challenges the spiritual values that are really important to us. And if we are to survive and not sink in the midst of all this bombardment, then we really have to band together in small communities. Well, it looks like that's all the time that we have for questions tonight. In future shows, we're going to be looking at a lot of different aspects of the spiritual journey. More importantly, I think we're going to be looking at some of the symbols that are found in our Catholic tradition, so that should be interesting. If you find any of this to be interesting to you personally and helpful, we'd encourage you to drop us a line at Reel to Reel, 222 North 17th Street, room 907, Philadelphia, PA 19103. We'd like to thank the audience who was here tonight. You were really great, tremendous questions, and it was a real pleasure being with all of you. And I'd just like to ask the Lord to bless all of us as we continue on our spiritual journeys.
Many people find retirement isn't as much fun as they thought it would be. Too much time on their hands, too little to do. The Retired Senior Volunteer Program has thousands of opportunities for retired executives, housewives, engineers, teachers, whatever your skills or schedule. RSVP has something to fit anyone's interests. You've learned a lot in your life. Share the experience of a lifetime.
Praise the Lord. I'm Father Ralph Chifo from the Charismatic Office. Jesus assures us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And each week at a Charismatic prayer group, we experience through sharing, singing, and learning the joy of knowing the Lord with us. Become one of us and all of our brothers and sisters in prayer and the joy of learning about Christ's death and resurrection. Contact us at 668-HOPE.